My name is Carius Velt, and I am the last man on Genna Prime who remembers what clean air tastes like. The first thing you need to understand about surviving a virus bombing is that survival itself becomes a form of madness. I watched my wife dissolve into screaming soup while I hid behind a blast door that was 3 centimeters thick. I heard my children calling for me as their voices turned into wet gurgles, then silence. I counted 17 hours and 43 minutes from the moment the first virus bomb cracked open above Hive Tertius, until the last human scream faded from the emergency communication channels. I am 47 years old. I have been alone on Genna Prime for 7 years, 4 months, and 16 days. The air around me writhes with bacterial life that wants nothing more than to crawl inside my lungs and turn me into food for itself. Every breath I take is filtered through machinery that I built from the corpses of my friends. The Death Guard did not come to conquer our world. They came to garden it. When the viral payload detonated in the upper atmosphere, it created a cloud of death that covered 3 continents in less than 6 hours. 10 billion people died that day. Factories full of workers collapsed into puddles of organic slime. Entire hab blocks became bacterial breeding grounds where human beings liquefied inside their own clothes. The planetary defense forces fired their weapons until their hands melted around the triggers. I survived because I was in the right place when the world ended, deep in the sewers beneath the hive, surrounded by filtration systems and emergency air supplies, protected by meters of rockcrete and steel from the nightmare that was consuming everything above me. I survived because I was a maintenance worker, a forgotten man whose job was to keep the infrastructure running while better people died gloriously in the Emperor's service. But survival came with a price that I did not understand until it was too late to pay any other way. The virus bombs fell at dawn on the feast day of St. Macarius. I remember this because I had been planning to take my family to the upper spires for the celebration, to watch the orbital mirrors catch the morning light and throw it down in golden shafts across the cathedral squares. My daughter Seva had never seen the sky without the filter of atmospheric processors. My son Marcus had been practicing the hymns he would sing during the morning mass. Instead, I was 3 kilometers underground, checking pressure readings on filtration systems that had been failing for months. Routine maintenance in the deep sewers, the kind of work that keeps 10 billion people breathing clean air and drinking water that will not kill them. Essential work that no one notices until it stops happening. The first bomb detonated directly above the primary hive spire. I felt it through the rockcrete foundations, a tremor that started as a whisper and built into a scream. The walls around me groaned with sympathetic vibrations as shock waves propagated through the planetary crust. Emergency lighting flickered and died, replaced by the hellish red glow of backup systems activating throughout the tunnel network. Then came the sound, not the sharp crack of conventional explosives or the deep thunder of orbital bombardment, but something else entirely. A wet tearing noise like flesh being peeled away from bone on a planetary scale. The sound of a world dying. The emergency communication channels erupted with reports that made no sense. Guard positions going silent without explanation. Entire regiments requesting medical assistance for symptoms that field medics could not identify. Atmospheric monitoring stations recording biological contamination levels that exceeded the measurement capabilities of their equipment. Through it all, the screaming. Voices on the Vox channels, human voices distorting into something else as they transmitted their final words. I listened to Colonel Vastian of the 34th Genna Rifles describe how his men were falling apart, their flesh becoming liquid while their bones remained solid. I heard Canoness Superior Valdris of the Order of the Bleeding Rose reciting the Emperor's prayer, even as her own voice dissolved into choking wet sounds that no human throat should make. The viral payload spread through the atmosphere like a slow tide of death. From my position in the deep tunnels, I could track its progress through the communication networks as they went silent one by one. The upper spires fell first, their inhabitants succumbing within minutes of exposure. The middle levels lasted perhaps an hour longer, their air filtration systems providing brief protection before the sheer volume of contamination overwhelmed their capacity. The lower levels, where my family lived, held out for almost 4 hours. I tried to reach them on the civilian communication frequencies, but the channels were chaos. 10 billion people trying to contact their loved ones simultaneously, their messages competing with emergency broadcasts and military coordination attempts. When I finally got through to our hab block, the voice that answered was not human anymore. It spoke with my wife's vocal patterns, but the words it formed belonged to something else. Something that had learned to use her mouth and throat and lungs to communicate desires that no human mind could comprehend. It told me about the beauty of dissolution, the peace that came with abandoning the prison of individual identity. It invited me to join the great work that was transforming our world into something greater than the sum of its parts. Then it screamed for 13 minutes straight before the line went dead. The virus bombs had not simply killed our world. They had infected it with something that treated human consciousness as raw material for purposes beyond comprehension. The dead did not rest quietly in their graves. They liquefied and merged and became components in bacterial matrices that pulsed with alien intelligence. And I was alone in the depths, listening to it all happen through communication equipment that still functioned in the tunnels where the air remained clean. The maintenance tunnels beneath Hive Tertius formed a network that stretched for thousands of kilometers through the planetary crust. Built during the early colonization period, they housed the essential systems that kept the Hive cities functional. Water purification plants, atmospheric processors, power distribution networks, waste management facilities, the forgotten infrastructure that supported 10 billion lives without ever receiving recognition or gratitude. I had worked in these tunnels for 23 years, ever since my discharge from the 15th Genna Guard following injuries sustained during the Orc raids on the northern continents. Shrapnel damage to my left lung had left me unfit for military service, but qualified for essential civilian work in the deep systems where air quality was controlled and monitored. My partner that morning was Talon, a young technician whose enthusiasm reminded me of myself 2 decades earlier. He had joined my crew 6 months ago, transferred from the mid-level systems after demonstrating exceptional skill with complex repairs. Jack believed our work mattered, that maintaining the infrastructure was service to the Emperor just as valid as carrying a lasgun or piloting a fighter craft. We were inspecting the primary filtration systems for Tertius Lower when the first bomb detonated. The blast wave propagated through the hive structure and into the deep foundations where we worked, causing pressure fluctuations in the air recycling networks that triggered automatic emergency protocols throughout the system. Jack was the first to notice the readings that would define the rest of my existence. His portable atmospheric analyzer began registering biological contaminants in the air supply from the upper levels. Compounds that matched no known toxin or chemical weapon in the Imperial database. "Senior Technician Velt," he said, his voice carrying the controlled alarm of someone trained to remain calm during emergencies. "The atmospheric composition readings from Intake 17 are showing massive biological contamination. Bacterial density levels that exceed anything in our reference materials." I moved to his position and examined the data myself. The numbers were impossible. Bacterial concentrations that should have been lethal to any known form of life, yet somehow stable and apparently self-sustaining. More disturbing still, the contamination was spreading through the atmospheric system faster than any natural infection could propagate. "Seal the intake valves," I ordered, following protocols designed for exactly this kind of situation. "Switch to emergency air reserves and isolate all systems connected to surface atmosphere." Jack's fingers moved across the control interfaces with practiced efficiency. activating blast doors and emergency barriers throughout the tunnel network. The deep systems had been designed with the possibility of surface contamination in mind, equipped with independent life support that could sustain essential personnel for extended periods. But as we worked to isolate our section of the tunnels, the communication channels brought us reports that challenged everything we thought we knew about biological warfare. The contamination was not behaving like any virus or bacteria in Imperial records. Instead of simply killing its hosts and spreading to new victims, it was transforming them into something else entirely. Infected humans did not die in the traditional sense. They dissolved into component biological materials that reformed into new structures, new forms of life that served purposes no human mind could comprehend. Through the emergency communication networks, we could hear the transformation of our world in real time. Guard commanders describing soldiers who continued fighting even as their flesh liquefied and ran like water. Medicaid personnel reporting patients whose cellular structure was reorganizing itself according to alien patterns. Civilian authorities cataloging the systematic dissolution of human society as the population was absorbed into something larger and more terrible. The viral payload was not a weapon of destruction, it was a tool of conversion, designed to transform entire worlds into something that served the needs of forces beyond human understanding. Jack and I found ourselves in the unique position of being able to observe this transformation from a position of relative safety. The deep tunnels were isolated from surface contamination, equipped with independent air supplies and emergency provisions. We became witnesses to the death of a civilization, recording the final hours of 10 billion human lives through communication equipment that continued functioning long after the voices on the other end had ceased to be human. The first day was the worst, though I did not understand this until much later. The bacterial contamination spread through the hive cities with relentless efficiency, transforming living tissue into organic soup that fed its own reproduction. We monitored the progress through atmospheric sensors and communication intercepts, watching the readings change as familiar voices were replaced by alien harmonies. The planetary defense forces attempted to contain the contamination through conventional means. They established quarantine zones and deployed fire teams equipped with flamers and melta-weapons. They bombed entire city districts from orbit, hoping to deny the virus the biological material it required for expansion. Nothing worked. The contamination adapted to their countermeasures, developing resistance to fire and radiation while spreading through vectors that bypassed traditional biological transmission methods. It learned from each failed containment attempt, incorporating new strategies and capabilities that made future resistance more difficult. Colonel Vask of the 127th Armored Regiment transmitted his final report at 13:47 hours on the first day. His voice was steady despite the chaos evident in the background noise of his transmission. Heavy weapons fire, the distinctive whine of lost cannons, and the screaming of men who were dying in ways that no medical training had prepared their commanders to understand. Command, this is Colonel Vask. The contamination has reached our secondary defensive line. We're seeing complete breakdown of biological integrity in exposed personnel. Request immediate extraction for uncontaminated units. The response from Planetary Command came through static-filled channels that spoke of communication networks failing across the globe. Colonel Vask, no extraction assets available. All orbital platforms report similar contamination events. Hold your position and await further orders. Sir, the enemy isn't advancing, they're not attacking us, they're just changing us. My men are dissolving where they stand, but they're still trying to follow orders while their bodies turn into soup. Emperor preserve us, they're still talking while their faces melt off their skulls. That was Colonel Vask's final transmission. Over the following hours, I monitored similar reports from across the planet as the carefully organized structure of Imperial military resistance collapsed under the weight of an enemy that could not be fought with conventional weapons. By the end of the first day, organized resistance had ceased. The planetary government had dissolved along with the officials who comprised it. The military command structure had collapsed as officers and enlisted personnel alike succumbed to the viral payload. The communication networks carried only the voices of things that had learned to speak with human vocal cords but served alien purposes. Jack lasted 18 hours before the isolation began to affect his mental state. He spent the first few hours after the bombing helping me seal and monitor the tunnel systems, following emergency protocols with professional competence. But as reports came in from across the planet, as we listened to entire civilizations being consumed by forces beyond our comprehension, his training began to break down. "We have to do something," he said during the evening of the first day, his voice carrying the desperate energy of someone who cannot accept helplessness in the face of catastrophe. "There must be survivors up there, people trapped in sealed buildings or protective bunkers. We could reach them through the maintenance tunnels, bring them down here where the air is clean." I understood his impulse. Every instinct of human decency demanded action, demanded that we attempt to save whoever we could from the nightmare consuming our world. But I also understood the numbers, the scale of contamination that made rescue missions impossible. "The atmospheric readings show bacterial saturation throughout the hive cities," I explained, pointing to the monitoring displays that tracked air quality across the tunnel network. Any exposure to surface conditions would result in immediate infection. The contamination is too complete, too widespread for conventional protective equipment to provide meaningful protection. Jack stared at the data screens, his young face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and desperation as he processed the implications of our situation. We were safe in the deep tunnels, but safety came at the cost of abandoning everyone else on the planet to fates worse than death. "My sister lives in Hab Block 77 Alpha," he said quietly. "She has 2 children. Marcus is 8 years old. Lila just turned 5 last month." I knew Hab Block 77 Alpha. It was located in the middle levels of Hive Tertius, connected to the atmospheric system that had been compromised within the first hour of the bombing. The bacterial contamination would have reached that level by mid-morning, transforming its inhabitants into organic components of the growing alien presence. "I'm sorry," I said, because there were no adequate words for the magnitude of loss we were witnessing. There was nothing anyone could have done. Jack spent the night attempting to establish contact with survivors through the communication networks. He broadcast on emergency frequencies calling for anyone who might be listening from sealed bunkers or protected areas. His efforts produced only static, interrupted by occasional transmissions from things that spoke with human voices, but carried messages that hurt to comprehend. One such transmission came through at 0347 hours on the second day. The voice was that of Administrator Korvac, whom I recognized from the civil authority broadcasts that had preceded the bombing. But the words that emerged from his familiar vocal patterns belonged to something else entirely. "Citizens of Genna Prime," the thing wearing Korvac's voice announced. "The transformation proceeds according to design. Individual suffering has ended. Collective purpose has begun. Those who remain isolated in protective environments are invited to join the great work. Resistance causes unnecessary delay in the optimization process." The transmission continued for 17 minutes, describing in clinical detail the benefits of surrendering to the bacterial contamination. The speaker claimed that infected individuals retained their consciousness while gaining access to perspectives that transcended human limitations. Death was not death, but elevation to a higher form of existence that served purposes beyond individual comprehension. Jack listened to the entire broadcast with growing agitation, His hands clenched into fists as he struggled to process what he was hearing. When the transmission finally ended, he turned to me with eyes that held more desperation than any human being should have to bear. "That wasn't Administrator Korvac," he said. "That was something else using his voice." "Yes," I agreed. "And it's trying to convince us to surrender ourselves to the same fate. But what if it's telling the truth? What if the people who've been infected aren't really dead, just changed into something we don't understand?" I had been wondering the same thing myself, though I lacked the emotional attachment that made Jack willing to consider surrender as a viable option. The transmissions from infected areas suggested that some form of consciousness survived the transformation process, but whether that consciousness remained recognizably human was another question entirely. "Even if consciousness survives," I said carefully, "it would be consciousness serving alien purposes. The beings that speak with human voices aren't trying to help us, they're trying to add us to whatever they're building up there." By morning of the second day, he had stopped trying to reach the surface. The bacterial contamination was not content to simply consume human tissue. As we monitored its spread through the atmospheric sensors, we began to detect evidence of more complex activities taking place in the infected areas. Organized construction projects using biological materials, coordinated movements of infected populations according to patterns that suggested central planning and control. The virus was not acting randomly, it was building something. Through our communication equipment, we could intercept transmissions from whatever intelligence was directing the contamination. These messages were not intended for human ears, but our equipment was sensitive enough to detect the electromagnetic signatures generated by the biological components of the growing alien presence. The transmission spoke of cultivation and preparation, of worlds being readied for purposes that transcended human understanding. Our planet was not being destroyed, but transformed into something that would serve as a component in a larger design spanning multiple star systems. The implications were staggering. Genna Prime was not the target of a single viral bombing, but part of a coordinated campaign affecting dozens of worlds across the sector. The Death Guard were not simply destroying Imperial civilization, but converting it into raw material for constructions that operated on galactic scales. We were witnessing the birth of something that thought in terms of millennia and measured success in the transformation of entire species. Jack's psychological condition deteriorated rapidly as this understanding dawned. The young technician who had reported for duty with enthusiasm and competence became withdrawn and erratic, spending long periods staring at blank walls while muttering prayers to the Emperor that grew increasingly incoherent. I tried to maintain his mental stability through routine and structure, assigning him maintenance tasks that would keep his hands busy and his mind focused on immediate problems. We conducted daily inspections of the tunnel systems, monitored atmospheric conditions throughout our isolated network, and maintained the equipment that kept us alive in the depths beneath a dying world. But the weight of our situation was too great for any normal coping mechanism to bear. Jack began to experience auditory hallucinations, claiming that he could hear voices calling to him from the sealed sections of the tunnel network. He would spend hours at the monitoring stations, insisting that the atmospheric readings showed clean air in areas we knew to be contaminated. On the third day after the bombing, he attempted to reach the surface through one of the emergency access shafts. I found him in the equipment bay, struggling into a hazmat suit that would provide no protection against the contamination levels we had recorded above. "I have to see," he said when I confronted him. "I have to know what happened to them." I disabled the access controls and sealed the shaft, preventing him from opening the blast doors that kept us isolated from the infected atmosphere above. The decision probably saved his life in the short term, but it also marked the beginning of a different kind of death that would consume him over the following weeks. The isolation was eating away at both of us, but it affected Jack more severely because he was younger and had less experience with the kind of solitude that maintenance work required. I had spent decades working alone in the tunnels, finding peace in the quiet efficiency of machines and the predictable patterns of technical problems that could be solved through knowledge and persistence. Jack needed human contact, needed the social interactions that gave meaning to existence for most people. Deprived of that contact, trapped in tunnels with only one other person for company, he began to create relationships with imaginary voices and phantom presences that provided the illusion of community. He would have conversations with his sister, describing his daily activities and asking about her children as if she could hear him through kilometers of contaminated rock. He reported for duty each morning to supervisors who existed only in his imagination, receiving assignments from phantom authority figures who gave him purpose beyond mere survival. For a time, these hallucinations seemed to provide psychological stability, allowing him to maintain the routines and procedures that kept our small enclave functioning. But as the days passed, his imaginary relationships became more important to him than his interactions with me. He began to resent my presence as an intrusion into conversations with people who existed only in his mind. He would interrupt our work to respond to voices I could not hear, abandoning tasks halfway through completion because his imaginary supervisors had given him new priorities. After 2 weeks, he stopped eating regular meals, claiming that the phantom voices had advised him to fast as preparation for spiritual elevation. After 3 weeks, he stopped speaking to me except to report imaginary contact with surface survivors who were planning rescue operations. I tried everything I could think of to bring him back to reality. I increased his workload, hoping that physical exhaustion would quiet the voices. I modified his medication using medical supplies from the emergency stores to provide chemical stability for his deteriorating mental state. I even considered sedating him completely, keeping him unconscious until the psychological pressure eased enough for rational thought to return. Nothing worked. The isolation and trauma had broken something fundamental in his mind, something that could not be repaired with the resources available in the deep tunnels. After a month, I found him in his bunk with his wrists opened by a maintenance knife, his blood pooling on the metal decking while his dead eyes stared at something only he could see. I was alone. The isolation that claimed Jack began working on me as well, though I had advantages that my young partner had lacked. 23 years of working in the deep tunnels had taught me to find meaning in solitude, to value the quiet efficiency of machines over the unpredictable chaos of human interaction. My military service had provided psychological conditioning that helped me function under extreme stress, but perhaps most importantly, I had a purpose that transcended mere survival. The atmospheric monitoring systems in my section of the tunnels were still functioning, still recording data about the contamination above. Someone needed to witness what was happening to our world, to document the transformation taking place so that future generations might understand the true nature of the threat facing humanity. I became the Chronicler of Apocalypse, recording atmospheric readings and communication intercepts that told the story of a planet's death and rebirth. Through my equipment, I could track the progress of whatever intelligence was directing the bacterial contamination, watching it reshape our world according to alien specifications. The construction projects detected during the first week expanded into massive engineering efforts that spanned entire continents. The bacterial matrices were not simply consuming organic matter, but organizing it into structures that served specific functions in a design too large for human comprehension. Cities were being rebuilt using materials derived from their former inhabitants. The rockcrete foundations remained, but everything else was replaced by biological constructions that pulsed with alien life. Roads became circulatory systems carrying nutrients to growing organs that might have been buildings or might have been creatures. The atmosphere itself was being modified, its chemical composition adjusted to support forms of life that existed nowhere in Imperial records. The most disturbing aspect of the transformation was its efficiency. Nothing was wasted in the conversion process. Human bodies provided protein and minerals. Human consciousness supplied information about planetary infrastructure and social organization. Human emotional responses were analyzed and cataloged for use in future psychological warfare operations. Every aspect of our civilization was being broken down into component parts and reassembled according to specifications that served alien purposes. The 10 billion people who had died during the bombing had not simply been killed, but harvested like crops and processed into raw materials for constructions that spanned multiple star systems. Through it all, I remained in my sealed tunnels, breathing filtered air and eating preserved rations while documenting the transformation of everything I had ever known. I became a living fossil, the last representative of a species that had been replaced by something larger and more terrible. The communication networks continued to function for almost 6 months after the bombing, though the voices that used them were no longer human. The things that had replaced our population maintained the technological infrastructure, apparently finding it useful for coordinating their activities across the planet's surface. I learned to interpret their transmissions, developing a rudimentary understanding of the language they used to communicate among themselves. They spoke of completion percentages and optimization protocols, of biological resource allocation, and structural integration requirements. Our world had become a vast construction project, and its former inhabitants were the raw materials being used to build something beyond human imagination. The efficiency reports they transmitted were particularly chilling. Detailed breakdowns of how human biological material was being processed and allocated across different construction projects. Protein extraction rates, mineral recovery percentages, consciousness integration statistics. The cold mathematics of genocide presented as routine production data. During the 8th month of my isolation, I detected the first signs that the project was nearing completion. The atmospheric readings showed stabilization of bacterial populations at levels that suggested equilibrium rather than continued growth. The construction activities were winding down, their purposes apparently fulfilled. And then came the day when ships began arriving from orbit. The vessels that landed in what had once been the central plaza of Hive Tertius were unlike anything in Imperial records. They were organic in construction, grown rather than built, their hulls pulsing with the same bacterial life that had transformed our world. Through my monitoring equipment, I could detect the electromagnetic signatures of massive cargo operations as the ships loaded biological materials for transport to destinations unknown. Our planet had been harvested. The realization that Genna Prime was not the final destination for the contamination, but simply a processing facility in a larger operation, changed my understanding of everything I had witnessed. The 10 billion people who had died during the viral bombing had not been casualties in a military campaign, but raw materials in an industrial process that operated on galactic scales. The Death Guard had not conquered our world. They had farmed it. Over the following weeks, more ships arrived to collect the products of our planet's transformation. Each vessel was loaded with biological cargo that had once been human beings, now converted into forms that served alien purposes. The operation was conducted with industrial efficiency, suggesting that this was routine rather than exceptional. The loading process took months to complete, during which I was able to observe the true scope of what had been accomplished on our world. Entire city districts had been converted into biological storage facilities, their former inhabitants processed into dense organic compounds that could be efficiently transported across interstellar distances. The ships themselves were marvels of biological engineering. their living hulls capable of maintaining cargo viability during extended space voyages. Their crews appeared to be human, but closer observation through my monitoring equipment revealed that they were infected individuals whose consciousness had been modified to serve as organic components in the vessel's operating systems. When the harvest was complete, most of the bacterial matrices that had replaced our civilization began to shut down. The organic structures that had grown from human tissue withered and died, leaving behind empty husks that would slowly decay over the coming years. The atmospheric contamination levels began to drop as the alien life forms completed their purpose and moved on to new worlds. I found myself alone on a planet that was dying for the second time. The monitoring equipment in my tunnels continued to function, but there was less to monitor with each passing day. The bacterial populations were declining as their food sources were exhausted and their purpose fulfilled. The communication networks went silent as the things that had used them departed with the harvest ships. For the first time in almost a year, I began to consider the possibility of returning to the surface. The atmospheric readings suggested that bacterial contamination levels were approaching baseline, though baseline on a world that had been subjected to viral bombing was very different from the clean air I had breathed before the Death Guard arrived. There would be chemical residues and biological traces that would affect the environment for decades to come, but the immediate threat of infection was diminishing. I spent weeks preparing for my first surface expedition, modifying my protective equipment to provide maximum security while allowing for mobility and extended operation outside the sealed tunnels. The hazmat suits available in the maintenance facility were designed for short-term exposure to known contaminants, not for exploring a world that had been transformed by alien forces. The modifications required cannibalizing equipment from throughout the tunnel network, combining atmospheric processors with medical monitoring systems and emergency life support units. The resulting suit was bulky and uncomfortable, but it provided complete isolation from external contamination while maintaining communication with my base in the deep tunnels. My first venture to the surface came 14 months after the viral bombing. The access shaft that led from the deep tunnels to street level had been sealed since the first day of contamination, its blast doors and atmospheric barriers protecting the lower levels from whatever horrors existed above. Opening those seals meant accepting the risk that some residual contamination might penetrate the tunnel network. But continuing to hide underground while the planet died around me had become psychologically impossible. The elevator that carried me upward through 3 kilometers of rockcrete and steel felt like a journey through geological time, ascending from the deep places where life had sheltered to the surface where life had been transformed into something else entirely. My modified hazmat suit provided complete atmospheric isolation, but I could still feel the weight of contamination pressing against the barriers that separated me from direct exposure. The blast doors at surface level opened to reveal a world that bore no resemblance to the one I had known. Hive Tertius had been home to 3 billion people before the bombing, a towering metropolis that stretched from the planetary surface to the lower reaches of the atmosphere. Its buildings had housed families and factories, schools and shrines, all the countless institutions that make human civilization possible. What remained was a vast necropolis of empty structures surrounded by bacterial residue that covered everything in a thick, oily film. The buildings still stood, their rockcrete and steel construction too durable for the contamination to break down completely. But they were hollow shells that had been stripped of everything organic. The streets were carpeted with a gray sludge that had once been human beings, now reduced to base proteins and amino acids that would slowly decompose over the coming years. In some places, this organic residue had been organized into geometric patterns that suggested the alien intelligence had used human remains as raw materials for constructions, whose purpose I could not determine. The sky above was the color of infected wounds, its atmosphere still carrying traces of the bacterial payload that had transformed our world. The orbital mirrors that had once reflected sunlight to the surface had been damaged during the contamination, leaving the city in perpetual twilight that made everything appear diseased and wrong. I spent 6 hours exploring the ruins of my former home, documenting what I found through the recording equipment built into my hazmat suit. The task was necessary but emotionally devastating, each familiar landmark transformed into evidence of unimaginable suffering. The hab block where my family had lived was empty but intact, its corridors and apartments stripped of organic matter but otherwise unchanged. I found the room where my children had slept, their toys still arranged on shelves that had been scoured clean by bacterial action. I found the kitchen where my wife had prepared our meals, its surfaces covered in the same gray residue that carpeted the streets outside. But I did not find bodies. The virus had been too thorough, too efficient in its conversion of biological material to leave recognizable human remains. My family had been dissolved into component molecules and incorporated into alien constructions, whose remnants were already decaying in the contaminated atmosphere. The only mercy was that their suffering had been brief. The viral payload worked quickly, transforming living tissue within minutes of exposure. They would not have had time to understand what was happening to them before their consciousness was absorbed into something larger and more terrible. That first surface expedition lasted only a single day, but it provided enough information to plan longer excursions that would allow me to explore more of the transformed world above. The contamination levels were within acceptable limits for protected exposure, and the bacterial populations were continuing to decline as their food sources were exhausted. Over the following months, I expanded my exploration to cover larger areas of the former hive city, and eventually the surrounding regions where smaller settlements had once existed. Each expedition added to my understanding of what had happened during the year of contamination, building a comprehensive picture of how an entire world had been systematically converted into raw materials for alien purposes. The scale of the operation was staggering. Every human settlement on the planet had been subjected to the same treatment, their populations dissolved and converted into biological materials that served the needs of the harvesting operation. Cities with billions of inhabitants had been reduced to empty shells surrounded by lakes of organic sludge. Industrial complexes had been stripped of their human workers but left otherwise intact, suggesting that the alien intelligence had found some use for our manufacturing capabilities. Most disturbing of all were the areas where the bacterial contamination had organized human remains into massive geometric constructions whose purpose transcended anything in Imperial knowledge. These structures covered hundreds of square kilometers and reached heights that challenged the engineering capabilities of pre-contamination civilization. They appeared to be some kind of communication or transportation infrastructure, designed to facilitate contact between the transformed world and whatever intelligence directed the harvesting operation. Analysis of their construction revealed that they were built entirely from processed human tissue, billions of lives converted into components of alien technology. The structures were not active during my explorations, their biological systems having shut down after the completion of the harvest. But they remained as monuments to the industrial efficiency with which our species had been converted into raw materials for purposes beyond our comprehension. I spent considerable time documenting these constructions, recording their dimensions and structural characteristics for transmission to Imperial authorities who might someday find my records. The engineering principles they employed were far beyond human understanding, utilizing biological materials in ways that seemed to violate basic physical laws. The most complex structure was located in what had once been the governmental district of Hive Tertius, built from the remains of approximately 2 million citizens who had been processed into specialized biological components. The construction towered nearly a kilometer above the surrounding ruins, its organic architecture pulsing with residual life even months after the alien intelligence had departed. At its base, I found inscriptions carved into processed human bone, symbols that hurt to look at directly but which seemed to convey information about the purpose and destination of the harvesting operation. The markings suggested that Genna Prime was one of dozens of worlds that had been processed during this phase of whatever vast campaign the Death Guard were conducting across the sector. Each world provided specialized biological materials that were combined with resources from other harvested planets to create constructions that spanned multiple star systems. Our world had been selected for its population density and genetic diversity, qualities that made our species particularly valuable as raw materials for certain types of biological engineering. The implications were staggering. The virus bombing of Genna Prime had not been an isolated military action, but part of an industrial operation that treated entire civilizations as crops to be harvested when they reached optimal maturity. The Death Guard were not simply destroying Imperial worlds, but converting them into raw materials for constructions that operated on galactic scales. After 2 years of surface exploration, I had documented the fate of our world in sufficient detail to understand the true scope of what the Death Guard had accomplished. Genna Prime had not been conquered or destroyed, but transformed into a processing facility that converted human biological material into products useful for construction spanning multiple star systems. The viral bombing had been the opening phase of an operation that affected dozens of worlds across the sector, each one subjected to the same systematic conversion of population into alien resources. Our deaths had served a purpose larger than any military campaign, feeding an intelligence that measured success in terms of galactic rather than planetary scales. But understanding the scope of the catastrophe did not provide comfort or meaning to my continued existence. I remained alone on a dead world, the last witness to a civilization that had been harvested like grain and shipped to destinations unknown. The isolation began to affect my mental state in ways that echoed Jack's psychological breakdown. Though my symptoms manifested differently due to the years of exploration and documentation that had given my existence purpose beyond mere survival. I began to experience auditory hallucinations similar to those that had claimed my partner, but instead of voices calling from contaminated areas, I heard conversations between people who had died during the viral bombing. My wife discussing dinner plans with our neighbor. My children arguing about toys they would never play with again. My former colleagues debating technical solutions to problems that no longer existed. The voices were perfectly clear and completely impossible, products of a mind struggling to cope with absolute isolation. I knew the hallucinations were not real, but they provided companionship that helped maintain my psychological stability during the long periods between surface expeditions. I began to respond to the imaginary conversations, developing relationships with phantoms that were more meaningful than any human contact I had experienced since Jack's death. The routine that sustained me included daily maintenance of the tunnel systems, regular monitoring of atmospheric conditions, and weekly expeditions to the surface to document changes in the contamination levels. This work provided structure and purpose, preventing the complete psychological collapse that would have resulted from acknowledging the hopelessness of my situation. But as the 3rd year of isolation began, I started to detect changes in the planetary environment that suggested my time as the sole survivor of Genna Prime might be coming to an end. The atmospheric readings showed increasing levels of bacterial activity in areas that had been dormant since the harvest ships departed. The organic residue that covered the surface was beginning to reorganize itself according to patterns that suggested the return of alien intelligence. Most ominously, my monitoring equipment detected electromagnetic signatures consistent with incoming spacecraft approaching the system from deep space. The harvest operation was not complete, Something was returning to Genna Prime. The ships that arrived during the 4th year of my isolation were different from the organic vessels that had collected the initial harvest. These were metallic constructions of clearly imperial design, though modified in ways that suggested they now served different masters. Their hulls bore the iconography of the Death Guard, but also carried symbols that belonged to no human organization. Through my monitoring equipment, I could observe their landing operations and the activities of the crews that disembarked to explore the transformed world above. These beings moved with the same bacterial contamination that had claimed our population, but they retained enough human appearance to suggest that they had been Imperial personnel before their conversion. They were not here to collect another harvest, but to prepare the planet for its next phase of use in the alien design. The organic residue that covered the surface was being reorganized into new structures, new constructions that would serve purposes I could not identify from my position in the deep tunnels. The realization that Genna Prime would continue to serve alien purposes long after its human population had been consumed filled me with a despair that threatened to overwhelm the psychological defenses I had constructed over the previous years. Our world would not be allowed to die quietly, but would be repeatedly violated and rebuilt according to specifications that served the needs of forces beyond human understanding. I began to consider whether continuing my witness was worth the psychological cost of observing further degradation of everything I had once called home. The documentation I had assembled over the past 4 years provided a complete record of what viral bombing could accomplish, sufficient to warn future generations about the true nature of the threat facing humanity. Perhaps it was time to join Jack in the peace that comes with abandoning the burden of continued existence. But before I could act on these thoughts, my monitoring equipment detected something that changed my understanding of my situation completely. Hidden among the electromagnetic signatures generated by the returning ships was a transmission pattern that matched Imperial military communication protocols. Someone else had survived the viral bombing. The signal was weak and heavily encrypted, suggesting that its source was either very distant or deliberately concealed. But the authentication codes were valid, indicating that whoever was broadcasting possessed legitimate Imperial military authority. More importantly, the content of the transmission suggested that organized resistance to the contamination was continuing somewhere in the galaxy. I was not the only witness to what had happened to our world. The discovery of ongoing Imperial resistance provided new purpose for my existence and new reason to continue documenting the alien activities taking place on the surface. My records might be valuable to military forces planning countermeasures against viral bombing campaigns, and my position on a transformed world gave me unique access to information about alien capabilities and intentions. I began modifying my communication equipment to establish contact with the source of the Imperial transmissions, though doing so required exposing my position to detection by the alien forces that had returned to our planet. The risk was significant, but the potential value of establishing contact with Imperial command authorities outweighed the danger of discovery. The modifications required several weeks of careful work, cannibalizing components from throughout the tunnel network to create a transmission array capable of reaching across interstellar distances while maintaining encryption protocols that would protect Imperial secrets from alien interception. The first successful contact came after 3 weeks of careful signal modification and transmission attempts. The voice that responded to my communication was human, though heavily processed through encryption and static scrubbing systems that made identification impossible. "This is Inquisitor Thalassa Vex of the Ordo Malleus," the voice announced through my jury-rigged communication array. "You are broadcasting from a quarantined world under hostile control. Identify yourself and report your status immediately." I provided my name, rank, and service record, along with a summary of the events that had led to my survival in the deep tunnels beneath Hive Tertius. The response came after a delay that suggested my information was being verified through channels that reached across multiple star systems. Technician Velt, your survival has been noted and your reports will be added to our intelligence files regarding Death Guard contamination protocols. You are ordered to continue monitoring alien activities and to transmit detailed observations according to the communication schedule I am now uploading to your equipment. The data package that accompanied her instructions contained encryption keys, transmission schedules, and reporting protocols that would allow me to contribute to Imperial intelligence gathering efforts across the sector. My isolation was ending, replaced by new responsibilities that connected my survival to purposes larger than personal witness. Over the following months, I provided regular reports to Inquisitor Vex and her associates, documenting the activities of the alien forces that had returned to our world, and the construction projects they were implementing using the biological residue left behind by the original harvest operation. These reports revealed that Genna Prime was being converted into a breeding facility for bacterial strains that would be used in future viral bombing campaigns. The organic matter derived from our population was being processed into increasingly virulent forms of the Life Eater virus, optimized for deployment against specific targets across the galaxy. Our deaths had not been an ending, but a beginning. The 10 billion people who had died during the original bombing were continuing to serve alien purposes as raw materials for weapons that would claim billions more lives on other worlds. The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating, but it also provided clarity about my purpose and responsibilities. I was not simply a survivor documenting a historical catastrophe, but an active participant in ongoing military operations designed to prevent similar disasters from occurring elsewhere. My reports to the Inquisition included detailed technical specifications of the bacterial breeding facilities, structural analyses of the organic constructions being built from human remains, and communication intercepts that revealed the operational plans of the Death Guard forces directing the project. This intelligence proved valuable to Imperial military planners developing countermeasures against viral weapons, and my unique position on a transformed world made me one of the few sources of information about alien capabilities and intentions available to Imperial command authorities. The work was dangerous, requiring me to conduct close reconnaissance of heavily contaminated areas while avoiding detection by the alien forces that now controlled our world. But the risks were justified by the value of the intelligence I could provide and the knowledge that my survival served purposes beyond mere witness. The bacterial breeding facilities were located in what had once been the primary industrial district of Hive Tertius, their organic constructions built directly on top of the manufacturing complexes that had served our world's economy. The alien forces directing the project had retained enough Imperial personnel to maintain basic technical operations, their consciousness modified to serve new masters while their expertise remained intact. Through careful observation, I was able to determine that the facility was producing modified strains of the Life Eater virus designed for deployment against specific target worlds across the sector. Each strain was optimized for the atmospheric conditions and biological characteristics of particular planetary populations, suggesting that the Death Guard possessed detailed intelligence about Imperial worlds that had not yet been subjected to contamination. The scale of the operation suggested that dozens of worlds were being prepared for simultaneous viral bombing campaigns that would dwarf the attack on Genna Prime. The bacterial strains being produced in our former cities would provide the raw materials for a sector-wide assault on Imperial civilization. As the 5th year of my isolation began, I received orders that would take me beyond the relatively safe confines of the tunnel network and into direct contact with the alien forces I had been observing from a distance. Technician Velt, Inquisitor Vex announced during one of our scheduled communications. Intelligence requirements have identified targets within the bacterial breeding facilities that require close observation and potential sabotage. You are ordered to infiltrate the primary processing center and plant monitoring devices that will provide real-time data about bacterial production capabilities. The mission was essentially suicidal, requiring me to penetrate facilities that were heavily contaminated and actively guarded by alien forces. But the intelligence value of real-time data about bacterial weapon production justified the extreme risks involved. I spent 2 months preparing for the infiltration, modifying my protective equipment and developing insertion routes that would allow me to reach the target facility without detection. The bacterial breeding centers were located in what had once been the primary industrial district of Hive Tertius. Their organic constructions built directly on top of the manufacturing complexes that had served our world's economy. The infiltration itself took place during the equivalent of night cycle, when alien activity levels were reduced but not eliminated. Moving through the transformed landscape required careful navigation around organic sensors that could detect human presence through chemical analysis of atmospheric traces. The breeding facility was a massive organic construction that pulsed with alien life. Its walls formed from processed human tissue that had been converted into specialized biological equipment. The interior spaces were filled with bacterial cultures growing in vats that had once been human beings, their consciousness absorbed into the collective intelligence that directed the production process. Planting the monitoring devices required direct contact with the bacterial cultures, exposing me to contamination levels that exceeded the protective capacity of my equipment. I could feel the alien organisms attempting to penetrate my defensive barriers, their hunger for human biological material driving them to test every weakness in my protection. The mission was successful in terms of intelligence gathering, but the exposure to concentrated bacterial contamination had consequences that would affect the remainder of my existence. Despite the protection provided by my modified hazmat suit, trace amounts of alien material had penetrated my defensive systems and begun the slow process of biological conversion. I was no longer entirely human. The changes began as minor alterations to my cellular structure, detectable only through medical equipment that I had salvaged from abandoned facilities during my years of exploration. Chemical analysis of my blood revealed the presence of alien DNA that was slowly integrating itself with my human genetic material. The process was too gradual to cause immediate symptoms, but I understood that I was being transformed into something that would eventually serve the same purposes as the bacterial cultures I had observed in the breeding facility. My consciousness would be absorbed into the collective intelligence that directed alien operations, and my body would become another component in the biological machinery that converted human life into weapons. But the transformation was proceeding slowly enough to allow me to continue my intelligence-gathering activities for an extended period. The alien organisms were apparently content to gradually convert my biological systems rather than attempting immediate assimilation, perhaps finding some value in maintaining my human capabilities during the interim period. I reported my condition to Inquisitor Vex during our next scheduled communication, providing detailed medical data about the conversion process and its likely timeline. Her response was characteristically direct and practical. Technician Velt, your contamination has been noted and will be factored into future mission planning. You are ordered to continue intelligence-gathering activities until such time as the conversion process interferes with your operational capabilities. When that point is reached, you will implement termination protocols to prevent alien forces from gaining access to Imperial intelligence through your compromised biological systems. The termination protocols included detailed instructions for destroying my communication equipment and eliminating any traces of my presence in the tunnel network. My death would be carefully orchestrated to prevent alien forces from learning about Imperial intelligence capabilities or the existence of other survivors on quarantined worlds. But until that time arrived, I would continue serving as the Inquisition's primary source of information about bacterial weapon development, and the long-term plans of the Death Guard forces operating in our sector. The final phase of my existence began during the 6th year after the viral bombing, as the bacterial contamination in my system reached levels that began to affect my cognitive functions and decision-making capabilities. I could feel my consciousness being gradually subsumed into something larger, my individual identity becoming part of a collective intelligence that spanned multiple worlds and star systems. The experience was not entirely unpleasant. The alien consciousness offered perspectives that transcended human limitations, showing me the galaxy from viewpoints that encompassed geological timescales and species-wide development patterns. I began to understand the purposes behind the viral bombing campaigns and the role that converted worlds played in designs that stretched across multiple millennia. But I also retained enough human awareness to recognize that these revelations were part of the conversion process, designed to make assimilation psychologically acceptable by providing the illusion of transcendence and enlightenment. The alien intelligence was very sophisticated in its manipulation of human consciousness, offering gifts of knowledge and perspective that made resistance seem petty and small-minded. My final reports to Inquisitor Vex included detailed descriptions of the conversion process from the perspective of someone experiencing it firsthand, along with technical specifications of the bacterial strains being developed for future deployment against Imperial worlds. This information would be valuable for developing medical countermeasures and protective equipment for personnel operating in contaminated environments. The transmission of my final report triggered the termination protocols that would eliminate all traces of my presence and prevent alien forces from accessing Imperial intelligence through my compromised biological systems. Explosive charges that I had placed throughout the tunnel network would collapse the entire facility, destroying my communication equipment and sealing the deep spaces where I had survived for 6 years. But before activating the destruction sequence, I took time to record this personal account of what viral bombing means from the perspective of someone who lived through it and documented its aftermath. These words are my final contribution to Imperial knowledge, a witness testimony that future generations might understand the true nature of the threat facing humanity. The virus bombs that fell on Genna Prime did not simply kill our population. They harvested us, converting our biological material into weapons that would be used against other worlds, other populations, other families like mine. The 10 billion people who died that day continue to serve alien purposes, their consciousness absorbed into collective intelligences that think in terms of galactic conquest rather than individual survival. Survival of viral bombing is not victory, but extended witness to horrors that exceed human comprehension. I have spent 6 years documenting the systematic conversion of everything I ever loved into raw materials for weapons designed to inflict similar suffering on countless other worlds. This is what it means to survive, to watch your civilization being digested and reformed according to alien specifications. To understand that your friends and family have become components in biological machinery that exist to perpetuate the same catastrophe across the galaxy. To know that your own body is being slowly converted into another tool in the arsenal of forces that consider human consciousness to be nothing more than raw material for their purposes. In 30 minutes, I will activate the termination sequence that will end my existence and eliminate the last traces of human presence on Genna Prime. The charges will collapse 3 kilometers of tunnels, ensuring that my compromise cannot be used to provide alien forces with information about Imperial intelligence capabilities. My death will accomplish more than my survival, denying the enemy access to strategic information while preserving the intelligence I have gathered for use by Imperial forces planning countermeasures against viral weapons. This is the final mercy that the Emperor grants to those who survive viral bombing. The opportunity to choose the manner and timing of our death, to ensure that our contamination serves Imperial purposes rather than alien ones. The Emperor protects, but sometimes his protection takes the form of explosive charges and the clean fire that burns away all traces of corruption. Sometimes protection is knowing when to stop fighting and when to ensure that the enemy gains nothing from your defeat. The countdown has begun. For the Emperor, for the dead of Genna Prime, for everyone who will die if the knowledge I carry falls into the wrong hands. Remember us not as victims, but as resources that were consumed in service to something larger than individual survival. Remember that viral bombing is not death, but conversion. Remember that the enemy does not simply kill, but harvests and transforms and uses our biological material to kill others. Remember that survival itself becomes another form of service to the alien forces that consider human consciousness to be nothing more than raw material for their purposes. And remember that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is choosing the moment and method of your own termination, denying the enemy the victory they seek through your continued existence. The Emperor protects, even when protection means ending your own life to preserve the lives of others. Even when mercy comes through the barrel of a melt-a-gun and the clean fire that burns away all traces of corruption. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. 1 second.